Lookalikes to quadratic equations. So now that we know multiple different ways to solve quadratic equations, we should be able to solve anything that resembles a quadratic equation. And let us remind ourselves what the standard form of quadratic equations are. ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. Now I'm going to show you a few other examples of equations that resemble this, but the key thing that we're looking for is that it's a trinomial, meaning it has 1, 2, 3 terms. And the other thing that we care about is that this variable here needs to be the square of this variable here. So if our middle variable is x, then we want to be able to square it to get to our first variable, which in this case is x squared. So we got from there to there. So let me show you a few examples of this. We actually have 4 of them. Okay? In the first one, our middle variable is x squared. If we were to square it, we would get x to the 4th. And that would give us our first variable here. And that works with the same as all the rest of these. So in example 2, my middle variable is the square root of x. And if I were to square it, I would get my first variable of x, because the square and the square root cancels out. In example 3, I have m to the 1/3 power as my middle variable. If I were to square it, I would go back to my exponent properties and I would multiply those fractions straight across. On the top, 2 times 1 gives me 2, and on the bottom, 3 times 1 would give me 3. So I would have m to the 2/3, which gives me my first variable here. Example number 4 is probably the most difficult to see because there's lots of different things happening there. But look at the parentheses. Our middle piece is this 2x minus 3 here. And when we square it, we get the first piece that we see there. So it does fit in our lookalikes of quadratic formulas. What we want to do now is we want to be able to figure out how to solve these. And since we have lots of different ways to solving quadratic equations, we also have the exact same ways of solving lookalikes to quadratic equations. So I have picked out the top few ways of solving quadratic equations, and I'm going to solve my lookalikes using one of these methods. The first method that I'm going to focus on is my factoring method. And since these are trinomials with 3 terms, we are just going to factor them by unfoiling them. Remember, whatever your middle term is here, that needs to be your first thing there. Now, if there's any numbers or coefficients to go with it, then we would have to include that as well. The second method I'm going to utilize is my quadratic formula. And the thing with this is, again, whatever your middle term is, that's what you're going to set equal to your quadratic formula. So normally our formula reads as x equals, and then the quadratic formula here. Whatever that middle variable is, so in my example I have u, that's going to be what my quadratic formula is. So we would read it as u equals negative b plus or minus square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So whatever that middle variable is, that's what you need to set equal to the quadratic formula. Now, other methods that you could use would be the completing the square method that you've just recently learned. Probably one method that you will not be able to use is the square root method. And the reason for that is your square root method needs to have this middle term missing. Well, if that middle term is missing, then it's not necessarily a quadratic formula lookalike. So we will probably not be using the square root method here. Now, the last method that I have identified here is the substitution method. What the substitution method does is it takes your lookalike equation and it transforms it exactly into a quadratic or a degree 2 equation. And then you could definitely do any one of your methods that we've seen before. However, at the end, you will need to substitute your variable back in to figure out the exact solution. Now, in my first example here, x to the fourth minus 3x squared plus 2 equals 0, I'm going to solve it using all three of these methods. However, in my other examples, I will probably just pick one and walk you through all of the steps, but I will also give you a quick glance of how to use the other methods as well. So the first thing I'm going to do with this one is solve it using the factoring method. This is a trinomial with no common factors, so we set it up with our two sets of parentheses equal to 0. Whatever your middle term is here, that's going to go exactly in these spots, because x squared times x squared, when you multiply those, that's going to give you your first term here. Now with your last term, it's going to factor just like a typical old thing. Factors of 2, we only have one choice of 1 times 2. And let's FOIL this out to check and make sure that we're on the right track. So first, we have x squared times x squared to give us x to the fourth. Outside, we have a 2x squared. Inside, we have a 1x squared. And last, 2 times 1 gives me 2. All I need to do is figure out my correct signs for these to make this FOIL work out correctly. I am looking for a negative 3x squared in the middle, which means my negative 2x squared minus 1x squared are both negative, as well as if I multiply those negatives times negatives, that would give me a positive here. So this does factor the way that we would expect it to. Now, what we can do from here is we can continue to factor, or we can jump right to the principle of zero products, since this is multiplied and set equal to 0. I'm going to go ahead and jump right to the principle of zero products, but just make a note that this one here factors as a difference of squares, if you would like to do that as well. So I'm going to set both of these equal to 0. And from here, I just solve each remaining equation. In the first one, I need to add 1 to isolate my variable, which gives me x squared is equal to 1. And then to get rid of my square, I force in a square root in both sides. Don't forget that forces in a positive and a negative. Gives us the answer of x equals plus or minus the square root of 1 simplifies to 1. Solving my right equation, I need to add 2 to both sides, giving me x squared is equal to positive 2. To get rid of my square, I square root both sides there with a plus or minus along with it. And that leaves me with x equals positive and negative root 2. Now take a note here that this is a degree 4 type of problem, and we should have 4 answers. We do positive 1, negative 1, positive root 2, and negative root 2. So our solution, x equals positive and negative 1, and positive and negative root 2. If the problem asks for it in a solution set format, then just put those answers in braces. Heck, if you even wanted, you could list all of your answers individually. The homework would accept that as well. So any one of those over here is going to be an acceptable answer. So box whichever one you prefer at this point. Now that was solving this one using the factoring method. This is where I'm going to stop this video. In the next video, I'm going to be doing the exact same example, but I'm going to be solving it using the quadratic formula and the substitution method.